look at that beautiful formation when it's together, I'm a very artistic person, but when I looked at that beauty, I said, that's the way it was meant to be.
As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale. It's not for sale, won't be for sale.
The Houthis have capitulated following the administration's strikes. In the president's words, the Houthis have announced that they don't want to fight anymore.
Happy Tuesday. I'm Ed O'Keefe in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, Boxing Day. President Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had a somewhat tense meeting in the Oval Office. The president says he wants friendship with our northern neighbor despite trade tensions, but won't give up on the idea of turning Canada into the 51st state.
It would really be a wonderful marriage because it's two places that get along very well. They like each other a lot.
Well, if I may, as you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
Yemen bombshell. Trump says the Houthi rebels have, quote, capitulated. They told the United States attacks against ships in the Red Sea will stop. The president will halt bombing campaign against them. Later this hour, conclave countdown. The vote to pick the next pope starts tomorrow. We have new CBS News polling about what American Catholics are looking for in their next pontiff. But here in Washington, we have international team coverage at the White House on the contentious Canada visit. CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro and Jackson Prosco, Washington bureau chief from our partners at Canada's Global News. Let's start with Aaron there on the North Lawn. The president and prime minister praised each other, Aaron, but that didn't stop Trump from taking aim on trade. Let's take a listen.
We want to make our own cars. We don't really want cars from Canada. And we put tariffs on cars from Canada, and at a certain point, it won't make economic sense for Canada to build those cars.
So after this meeting today, Aaron, what is the state of tariffs between the two countries?
Yeah, Ed, good to be with you. It seems like the tariffs are still in flux, as Prime Minister Carney told reporters after that it was more so just a first step meeting as the U.S. and Canada are kind of introducing themselves with this new administration for President Trump and this new prime minister. And auto tariffs in particular, which we just heard President Trump talk about, Prime Minister Carney told reporters in a press conference that he reiterated his stance that he believes through supplying many of the auto parts used by American companies, that Canada is helping keeping American companies when it comes to autos competitive. Said they're still looking for an arrangement that works for both countries. And really, overall, just said that this was the first step, so that there would be further talks in person between the two North American leaders at the G7 summit in Alberta in mid-June.
It's funny because the president keeps saying, you know, Americans don't want to have to do business in Canada or don't want Canadian vehicles. There are so many industries in this country who either operate on both sides of the border or are so reliant on them. So for him to continue to say that just flies in the face of economic reality. I'm sure the prime minister was thinking that as well as he sat there. Now, once again, he brought up the idea of turning Canada into the 51st state, didn't he?
He did. And President Trump replied to Prime Minister Carney, firmly saying that would never happen. President Trump responded, quote, never say never, a potential lyric reference to Canadian pop star Justin Bieber, of course. But President Trump afterwards only conveyed praise for Carney, said, when asked by reporters, when are you going to start calling him governor like you did with the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, President Trump said that he hasn't done that yet, doesn't expect to. And we heard the Prime Minister say in that press conference afterwards that he had asked President Trump to stop referring to Canada as the 51st state, saying it was, quote, not useful, though he did not share President Trump's response.
Well done there with the Justin Bieber reference. Aaron Navarro on the North Lawn. Thank you, sir. Let's turn to Jackson Prosco with our partners at Global News. Also there just outside the White House, Washington bureau chief for Global News. I'm curious, the prime minister says he asked the president directly to stop suggesting Canada become the 51st state. I want to play this for people. Let's take a listen.
He's the president. He's his own person. I would go back to showing the difference between a wish and a reality. We're very clear. I've been very clear publicly, consistently. I've been very clear in private. I was clear again in the Oval Office. Would be clear throughout. The president, he understands that we're having a negotiation between sovereign nations.
I believe it was in French that he said that he essentially told the president all that talk about being a 51st state isn't useful anymore. Did he do enough today, the prime minister, to impress Canadians back home and assuage the concerns they've had about what the president's been saying?
I think so, Ed. I think the part of the story that's really been underappreciated in the U.S. and perhaps even inside the White House is just how angry Canadians are. And it's not about the tariffs. It's about the 51st state talk. I mean, that is something that Canadians take as an affront. Mark Carney essentially just won an election on running against Donald Trump, on standing up to President Trump, and on pushing back against that 51st state talk. And so what you saw today were pretty carefully choreographed speaking points from the Prime Minister in which he almost seemed to use Trump's own words against him. You played that tape of Carney saying, hey, I know real estate too, and I know that some things are not for sale. That's the type of scripted message, I think, that was going to land well with President Trump and make it clear that Carney was serious about this, putting his foot down. And you almost saw the president back off the talk ever so slightly and say, look, this is not an overnight thing. This is a long-term conversation. But he acknowledged it takes two to tango, in his words.
Yeah, it must have been a workshopped answer that clearly landed well because the president seemed to get the message there in that moment, at least. But the prime minister's been tough on the U.S. in the past, especially out on the campaign trail in recent weeks. He did bring some of that to the Oval Office today. Here's some of what he had to say.
Our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over.
Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever.
So going forward, what is the sense of how exactly the prime minister is going to navigate his relationship with the president?
Well, I think he's feeling good tonight. You know, not long ago, President Trump spoke and actually said he quite liked Mark Carney, and he thought that they got off to a really good start. I think you have to appreciate, and the president said this himself today, that a lot of the animosity that was there really had to do with the fact that he did not get along with Justin Trudeau, the former prime minister, nor did he get along with the former foreign affairs minister and deputy prime minister Chrystia Freeland, who was part of renegotiating the NAFTA talks. And Trump made that perfectly clear today. And by the end of the day, the fact that he is heaping praise on Mark Carney, even joking in the Oval Office that it was a tough but friendly conversation, wasn't going to be a blowout like he had with Volodymyr Zelensky, that is all positive if you're Mark Carney tonight. So I think he's going to head back to Canada and think that this was mission accomplished.
Yeah, on a scale of 0 to Zelensky, this was by no means that kind of a meeting, which is probably encouraging for both sides. Jackson Prosco, thank you for joining us there. Big night for you and the coverage back home in Canada. We appreciate you taking some time to talk to us. The Supreme Court, meanwhile, is set to allow the Trump administration to enforce a ban on transgender service members. The 63 order was divided along ideological lines and allows the administration to proceed as legal challenges move through lower courts. CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford joins me now for a little more analysis of this. Walk us through this decision today and what it means in practicality for the administration as it tries to enforce this ban.
Well, I mean, you really just hit the nail on the head. I mean, it means that the Trump administration will be able to implement it while the litigation continues in the lower courts. It was an unsigned order. The justices didn't give any explanation for why they were lifting this nationwide injunction. Neither did the three liberals who would have kept that in place. But what that means is now this order, which, as you know, Ed, was one of the very first ones the president did on his first day in office. He revoked President Biden's policy. He issued his own executive order allowing transgender service members to serve in the military, and then followed that up a week or so later with his own executive order to ban them. Now, this is similar, and the administration argued in court in their filings that it was essentially indistinguishable from the policy that Trump had in his first term. And during that time, the Supreme Court also allowed it to take effect.
So there's more than one case regarding this working its way through the lower courts, right?
That's right. So the one that they looked at today was this nationwide injunction entered by a federal district judge in Washington state. The federal appeals court there based in California will take a look at this case now. It'll go back down there. There's also a case here before the federal appeals court in D.C. And then there's another one in New Jersey. What does that mean? That means that as this litigation goes forward, it's very likely to, at some point, get back to the Supreme Court for a decision on the merits. I would expect the Ninth Circuit very well could come out differently than the D.C. Appeals Circuit Court of Appeals here, which would mean you've got that division, and the justices we'll have to weigh back in and look at the merits.
And there's at least one of these cases involves 7 transgender service
one
members. What has been their argument to continue? And do we have any sense, do they now literally have to step away from service as they continue fighting this?
I think that there's another week or 30 days. I'm not sure the time period where the administration has to figure out how they're going to implement it, but that essentially seems to be the gist of the executive order, yes. They argued, the transgender service members argued that, they've served our country honorably and that this order is blatantly unconstitutional. It's a prohibition on transgender people in violation of the First Amendment, equal protection issues. And so that's been kind of the force of their arguments, just like that was very similar arguments made 8 years ago in Trump's first term.
Yeah.
But the administration argues in their filings that, the military is entitled to great deference. And the Pentagon concluded that, quote, it was, quote, affecting military readiness and lethality. And so they believe that this was essential to having an effective fighting force. So
this likely now goes another year at least, though, right? It won't be decided by the end of this term.
I don't think it'll be that quickly. I mean, I think it would. I mean, they could do anything on an emergency basis like we saw today. But I think that this would be something that's probably a year away.
Okay. Jan Crawford, our chief legal correspondent, thanks for that. We'll catch up with you soon. CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata joins us now from over at the Pentagon. What do we know now about the nuts and bolts of implementing this ban? And do we have any hard numbers on how many service members are transgender?
Yes. And Ed, we're going to get to that in a minute because there's been no official statement from the Pentagon. I don't expect that we'll get one, but the reason I'm looking down at my phone is Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth reposted another massive victory in the Supreme Court. This is from Caroline Leavitt, saying Trump administration can enforce transgender military ban, Supreme Court says. Again, restoring readiness and lethality, not DEI or gender ideology. So this is something the Defense Secretary has been behind, if you want to put it that way, from day one after President Trump's executive order on that term. And as Jan said, revoking an order that had already been in place by President Biden to let transgender members serve. So it's been a roller coaster for transgender members that we've spoken to. A lot of them just said, look, I'm going to quit because I can't take the uncertainty. Some of them have families. Many took issue what was seen as like a personal attack, an executive order that wrote in part, it's inconsistent, an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle. Now, in terms of numbers, it's hard to tell because in terms of how the DOD describes people that have or transgender individuals, they say they describe it as gender dysphoria, right? A medical condition that would disqualify them from service. In that regard, according to statistics, 0.2% of service members. That puts the number at about 4,200 people. But advocacy groups that we've spoken to said the actual number is around 15,000. And they also point out these are highly trained, highly experienced individuals, and their removal would have an impact on force readiness.
Yeah, and that's part of the argument about the back and forth is that what are you doing to potentially disrupt military operations if you're pulling people out, allowing them to get back in? But it'll all play out in the courts in the coming year or so. One other thing we got to get to with you today, the president announcing the U.S. and the Houthis have come to an agreement to stop attacks against each other. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that announcement, if you want to call it that, a surprise announcement came out of the Oval Office this afternoon. It sent all of us scurrying here to find out what that meant. Yes, the United States has stopped or will soon stop their military operations against the Houthis. Now, this new operation had started, or the intensification of it, had started back in March, right? 7-8 weeks or so now. And that will stop. That doesn't necessarily mean that what we've seen in the past couple of days, the Israelis hitting the Houthis and really bombarding the Houthis, those are two separate operations. The United States military has made clear, officials have made clear, that what the Israelis have been doing in the past couple of days had nothing to do with the United States aside from, deconfliction and cooperating in terms of conversations they were having about what the Israelis were doing and when. But last week, Sean Parnell, part of the DOD, said 1,000 targets had been hit. So they've really been bombarding the Houthis, but it came as something of a surprise. The first confirmation we got was actually from the Foreign Ministry of Oman, who have been the mediators between the United States and the Houthis. The Houthis, to their part, they said they're not really going all the way with this. They haven't said it's a ceasefire. They're looking to see what actions the United States are going to take from this point on. The other question is why would they have folded now? It may be that they genuinely couldn't sustain the bombardment that they were taking, because the United States is throwing a lot at them over the past 7 or 8 weeks, and now they're also dealing with the Israelis. So, and I can also tell you that the Israelis weren't informed that the United States was going to pull back from this military operation. So,
and all of this coming, of course, right before the president goes to the Middle East. So that may have been part of why they wanted to rush this out the door, to show that the U.S. is doing something to bring peace to that region.
Exactly that.
We'll see. All right, Charlie Daggett over at the Pentagon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed.
Some Minnesota residents who voted for President Trump aren't happy with the direction of his administration, at least according to their senior senator, Amy Klobuchar, who happens to be a Democrat. More on what she had to say next. Stay with us. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Russia says it's still planning to adhere to a 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine beginning Thursday, but will respond if Ukrainian forces attack. That may be the case, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has rejected the ceasefire, labeling it a, quote, theatrical performance. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar shared her thoughts on the war and much more while speaking with our own Major Garrett in Arizona over the weekend.
Walk me through what you think the next month or so looks like for Ukraine. And do you believe its future flows through the Oval Office under President Trump?
I think it's hard to do without America. We've been by their side from the beginning, but clearly there's a coalition. Europe has been standing up. They've shown their willingness not only to give funds for this effort. There's now 23 countries that are putting 2% of their GDP into defense, but they have pledged, in the case of the French and the British, to actually have troops in Ukraine after there's a peace agreement to be able to enforce it, because that's been the problem before. So I don't think it's us alone. I do think the signing of the mineral agreement was important, was a priority for President Trump, and it could then pave the way. While we have, 1 week it's a sprint, then it goes away. But my hope is that it somehow paves the way for more discussions. Obviously, I don't agree with some of the kind of pre-concessions that were made, because I'm not sure that's how you should negotiate, but we are where we are.
Everyone in the Senate and the House wants the president to get this right. What's your biggest hope in the get it right column? What's your biggest fear in the, oh man, we really blew this column?
Well, I am really concerned if somehow we do nothing, because literally he will then feel emboldened, Putin will, who's shown his colors before, that he would be willing to go into other Baltic states, and we actually then would be triggering a war, a World War III, if he's heading into NATO countries. So that's my biggest fear. The hope here is that because Europe has been standing up, the president can show that there's been a change and that they've been contributing. The hope is that given that 40% of government spending out of Russia right now is spent on defense, that because of this war, that is not really sustainable. The fact that their best ally appears to be North Korea, not really the friend you'd want. And the fact that there are still significant economic sanctions, when lifted, could be helpful. And could I say 69 senators, which is enough to even override a veto if that happened, and I would hope it wouldn't. 69 senators have signed on to a bill, including I have as well, to expand these sanctions and to make sure they're strong, that Senator Graham is leading.
Another topic of conversation here has been China and Taiwan. How do you factor the trade conflict now, which is essentially, as the Treasury Secretary described it, many days later, it was obvious at the front, but it took him several days to say, though privately, it's a trade embargo. That's what it is.
Yeah.
How does that factor through our relations in the region, Taiwan, and Russia?
So we'll start with the values here. I mean, we know that we are a democracy, and in the end, democracies work. And China is betting on the fact that somehow we're going to fall apart and they will become a leader worldwide. They already have people they do business with, clearly. And you look at what they've done. They've stolen our own intellectual property. They have done all kinds of things that
Manipulate
hurt
currency,
democracy and
ownership requirements, all those.
go on and on and on. That's a fact. So how do you deal with them? Well, I think you deal with them not alone, but with allies. And you deal with them by looking again at trade agreements in the Asia area. Right now, we have strong relationships, and have, at least maybe till now, with Australia and New Zealand, and the relationships that we have with Japan and Korea, all incredibly strong nations. So you build on that. You look at negotiating with Europe again in a trade agreement, and then you start applying pressure on China. You can do it right now, but not in the way it's been done. As you just pointed out, it's like an embargo. A lot of the voters in my state that voted for Donald Trump and me, and there's a whole bunch of them, they thought he was going to work on things like lowering costs on housing and child care and health care, things they really care about. That has not been happening. Instead, we kind of have this daily chaos. Chaos is up, corruption is up, costs are up. That's what's happening. That's not what they buy into.
You know this question gets asked a lot, and I want to put it to you gently.
Oh, no.
For the Democratic Party, what does this moment require?
Well, this requires an acknowledgement that we need to be a party that actually has the back of people. And people are going to talk about it in different ways. You'll have more moderate and conservative Democrats. You'll have Bernie Sanders out there and AOC doing their
drawing
tours.
huge crowds.
I think all of this can work together. I have seen myself rural town halls that I've held where you'll have activists there. I had one where they had a sign that said, "This is not normal," one of the activists. And there was a farmer next to her, and he said, "What does that mean? I'm normal." And she goes, "No, this is the sign we use." And so I don't think this is bad that people have different views. But I think we have to acknowledge that if we're really going to do something positive here, we've got to make some changes to some of the things and how we talk about them.
We'll have more of Major's interviews from the Sedona Forum throughout the week. Now, campaign 2026 is already in full swing, and there are only 545 days until Election Day 2026. Did you know? So coming up next, the race is heating up and where the balance of power in Washington could be determined. Never too early to discuss this on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. As we get closer to the 2026 elections, we are inching so much more closely. It's all happening because already officials are declaring their candidacy for a different office from the one they're sitting in right now. What effect could this end up having on the balance of power in the now GOP-controlled House? Look how tick-tock tight it is there between them. Anyone going missing for a day and a vote could get canceled. That's how tight it is. Hunter Woodall may have the answer for us. He joins us now. Sir, good to see you. There are a handful of races you're watching in which a House member risks flipping their seat to the other party by leaving to run for a higher office. Which ones are you watching specifically?
Well, Ed, this is that time where, candidates, especially these folks that are in the House, they can start testing their ambitions. So there's three contests I'm really interested in. There's a House seat in Minnesota where Representative Angie Craig, she's running for the Senate. There's a House seat in Michigan. John James, he's running for governor. He's a Republican. And you also have a House seat in New Hampshire. Chris Pappas, he's running for the Senate seat that's being vacated in 2026. This is that time where candidates who are looking at this, they're thinking, hey, can I be something more than a U.S. House member? Can I represent my state statewide?
And is there an instance from the last go-round of a member of Congress who ran for a different office and a member of the opposite party ended up taking their seat?
Absolutely. You just have to look at the presidential battleground state of Michigan. You had Alyssa Slotkin. She was a House member in 2024. She ran statewide for the Senate seat, narrowly won, helped, that was a bright spot for Democrats during a very, very tough election cycle. But she also, the House seat she left behind ended up flipping. A Republican, Tom Barrett, won that seat, albeit in a close race. And that's that kind of risk that each party can run. You have an ambitious, talented candidate. They've held a House seat that can be tough to keep. They move on to a higher office, and then that seat can flip.
And, midterms can often be sort of a moment of reckoning for the party in power in the White House. Aren't the odds in the Democrats' favor anyway in most of these races?
Ed, it's so early. There's all those numbers about, what we've seen in past midterm cycles and tradition. The House Republicans campaign arm is arguing, hey, they think they're in a much better spot than they were at this time in 2017 when Donald Trump, was serving his first term ahead of that first midterm of his in 2018. But right now, Democrats, they're still struggling to figure out that path out of, these tough setbacks they had in the 2024 election. And they're trying to figure out that messaging, that pattern, and I think we're still struggling to see how each party is moving closer to 2026.
But it is incredible how you mentioned those 3 seats in Minnesota, Michigan, New Hampshire. Wouldn't it be something if it comes down to those 3 flipping in either direction and who controls the House? We'll be monitoring it, obviously, again, over the next 545 days until Election Day 2026. Hunter Woodall, thank you, sir. We are still following today's Oval Office meeting, that incredible exchange between the leaders of the United States and Canada, where Prime Minister Mark Carney told President Trump his country is unequivocally not for sale. Let's bring in our panel. Megan Messerly is a White House reporter at Politico. Julia Manchester, a national political reporter for The Hill. Ladies, good to see both of you. Megan, the Prime Minister had to walk that fine line today, complimenting the President to some extent, being diplomatic, while making sure he made very clear, as he did at least once or twice, that Canada isn't for sale. How do we think he did?
I think talking to people going up to this meeting on both the Canadian side and the U.S. side, we knew that this 51st state jab that the president likes making at Canada was going to come up, and it was going to be a challenge, and it was going to be a test for Prime Minister Carney to see how he dealt with it. And I think the thinking is that he sort of dealt with it in the best way he could, right? He needed to, for sake of his own political future, maintain that Canada is not for sale. This is not up for discussion, while at the same time sort of maintaining this jovial, friendly atmosphere with the president. And I think he was sort of able to sort of strike that line. We saw, him mouth back to the camera at one point, never, which was sort of a striking moment, but just sort of speaks to that sort of way. And I will mention some allies of the president's who I had been speaking with ahead of this said this is exactly how Prime Minister Carney needed to approach this. He needed to sort of be a little playful, be firm, obviously, in his stance, but that the president would respect that, so long as he sort of treated it in a jovial manner. We didn't go the Zelensky route.
And nothing will top that, at least not yet. But I thought it was interesting that in the run-up, you also had administration officials trying to play this down, like, oh, it's not that big a deal. This is the biggest economic relationship the United States has. And despite what the president was suggesting today, that we don't want to do business with China or with Canada, we don't want Canadian-made vehicles, the reality is we do, because so many different industries do so much work up there.
Absolutely. And Canada is obviously one of the U.S.'s closest allies, right? There's this longstanding relationship between the two countries. I think what it came down to, and we were hearing this in the days leading up to this meeting, is, I was asking people in the White House, I was asking, allies outside the White House saying, what does the president think of Prime Minister Carney? And they were like, he honestly just doesn't. He doesn't have thoughts on him yet. He hated Prime Minister Trudeau. It's not that. So that was a step up. But I think what we saw out of today's meeting is, the president was very laudatory of Prime Minister Carney. He even said later in an event, that he was sort of a step up from Justin Trudeau, congratulated him on the election win. So I think we've seen sort of the foundations for a much better relationship, obviously, than the one he had with Prime Minister Trudeau.
Julie, up on Capitol Hill there, the Republicans at least trying to work through a budget proposal. Big aspect of that will be the future of Medicaid and whether or not or how much do you cut out of it? How do you rearrange it in such a way that saves money but doesn't cost Republican seats? And there's now a conservative organization essentially providing some air cover to Republicans who are taking it on the chin from left-leaning groups concerned about the future of Medicaid, right?
Yeah, this is really the first time we've seen Republicans come out in a unified voice in many ways to push back against these Democratic attacks, accusing them of looking to cut Medicaid. This is from the American Action Network, which is a sister organization to the Congressional Leadership Fund. They're spending $7 million in 30 congressional districts, in Republican and Democratic districts, essentially touting Republicans, what they say is their connection to Medicare, Medicaid, what they've done to do that, and attacking Democrats for supporting the Inflation Reduction Act, attacking the Biden pill policy, as they call it, which they say would essentially weaken research into potentially life-saving drugs, et cetera. So this is where Republicans are really looking to push back against Democrats, but still there is a lot of concern right now among Republicans. In fact, just over the last hour, before. We saw Congressman Rob Whitman, who represents Virginia's 1st congressional district, not exactly a toss-up, but Democrats are targeting that district, come out and say, look, I told Steve Scalise and Mike Johnson that any sort of cap on per capita spending or any sort of lowering of federal match spending would be a no-go, essentially. So there are still a number of moderates and Republicans in swing districts who aren't comfortable with where leadership is, and leadership is trying to essentially balance those Republicans with the hardcore fiscal hawks from the Freedom Caucus who want deeper cuts.
And that's interesting that a Virginian is saying that, knowing that there's a governor's race later this year in Virginia, where this inevitably would become an attack on Republicans. So they must be seeing something now in the polling that suggests don't go there, even in the Old Dominion.
Absolutely, and it kind of, just to zoom out to look at Virginia, I mean, Virginia is so fascinating, obviously, because it's so close to Washington, D.C. You have so many federal workers. You have so many people living, even though Rob Whitman's district is in the Henrico area, the greater Richmond area, it's so close in proximity, relatively close in proximity to Washington, D.C. So this is a good test case for them.
We heard today from the Treasury Secretary regarding trade talks, and there's been some hope that there'd be some announcements regarding India, South Korea, maybe the UK this week. But he acknowledged something on China that the president has not.
Yes.
And what is that?
Yes, he made clear that there are not talks happening right now, which is something that the president has tried to imply in varying degrees. A week ago, I asked him on Air Force One, I said, have you talked to President Xi this term since taking office? And he said, I don't want to talk about that. And so now we're
despite telling Time magazine that he had talked to him.
Yes, exactly. But he was never firm about the time frame in which he had talked to him, which is the big challenge. So what we're hearing now from the Treasury Secretary is this confirmation of what we've long suspected, which is that these talks are not happening, even as the administration is very eager to tout some sort of a win this week. Again, not clear whether that's actually going to come to fruition. White House official told me yesterday it could be 0 deals, it could be 5 deals. We really don't know. And so I think this sort of just speaks to the state of flux that we're in right now with tariffs, right? As Secretary Besson and others work to negotiate these deals one by one. We're still hearing, India had, I keep hearing India, Japan, South Korea, I keep hearing, you have to wait till after their election, but you could get some sort of framework in place. The UK popping up today, obviously that deal was already, somewhat in progress before Liberation Day and all of this started. And so the question now is, which one is going to come first? But the bigger question is what's going to happen with China, because even if you go announce a deal with one of these other countries, that does not eliminate these pain points with China and the massive tariff war that we are in with them.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about one of the other big political developments this week, Julia, the decision by Georgia Governor Brian Kemp not to run. The jockeying now to run has got to be pretty intense down in Georgia.
Yeah, well, first, I think arguably a bit of a recruiting loss for Republicans at the Senate level. I mean, a lot of Republicans I've talked to have said, look, we always knew this would be a possibility. But Brian Kemp is someone who has been very successful in Georgia, running statewide, towing that line between MAGA and maybe more establishment Republican. But now you have a plethora of different Republicans starting to jockey. You have Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is not ruling this out. She'd certainly do well in a Republican primary, but in general election against Jon Ossoff, a lot of questions there. John King, insurance commissioner, he's really an up-and-coming name. Buddy Carter, a congressman, he appears to have ruled this out. You have Rich McCormick, another congressman who is said to be considering this. So this could be a pretty big Republican primary. But it's important because Jon Ossoff is arguably the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent. So if you have a Republican limping out of a bloody primary, that hands it in many ways to Democrats.
545 days to go until Election Day 2026. Maybe you heard. Lots can happen between now and then. Megan Messerly and Julia Manchester, thank you for being here. Meanwhile, in Vatican City, cardinals are getting ready to vote for the next pope. Remember that? What our brand new CBS News polling says about how American Catholics are feeling about it all. Stay with us. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Cardinals are set to pick the next pope in a secretive ritual we call a conclave, which starts tomorrow in Vatican City. They're going to hold as many rounds of voting as needed inside the Sistine Chapel there. You see the final preparations in place. Billions, arguably, will be watching the chimney on top of the chapel there. Black smoke, of course, means no pope yet. White smoke means we have a new pontiff. And we also have new CBS News polling on this subject. And for that, we turn to Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, who's in New York, with new data on the conclave. Anthony, what are American Catholics looking for in a new leader, and how does that relate to Pope Francis?
Good to talk to you, Ed. No smoke coming out of the touchscreen, which is probably good. But we do have a new poll. Look, here's the big number. You get wide approval among U.S. Catholics for the direction in which Pope Francis, in their mind, led the Catholic Church. And what that leads to then is, do they think that the next pope, whoever it is, ought to continue Pope Francis's teachings? And you do get a big number, 4 in 10, who say that the next pope ought to. There is a third that say, no, there should be more conservative teachings, and then another 21% who say, well, more progressive teachings. But the other thing here is, where does Francis leave the church? And this is what the next pope is going to be looking at. Before Pope Francis, fewer Catholics in the U.S. said that the church was in touch with the needs of Catholics. And that number over the course of the years went up to now where it's a majority. So that's the relatively better position that in the minds of U.S. Catholics, the Pope Francis left the church at.
Yeah, polling obviously won't play too big a role in this. More like prayer, probably, cardinals would tell you. But that is interesting, that there's further surveys suggesting now people want some consistency with what Francis was up to. Now, he spoke out on many different issues. Is that what Catholics want?
By and large, yes, it is. You get almost 2/3 who say that they do want the next pope to speak out on world political affairs, et cetera. And then the other part, speaking of around the world, we ask, well, where should the next pope come from? What region of the world? And by and large, U.S. Catholics said that's not important. But the ones who do pick, when they do pick, the U.S. is the top answer. They would like to see a U.S. pope. And, you know, I will point out to folks here, if you look at where cardinal electors are from as they gather there in the Sistine Chapel, this is your map of that. And you see, you got 16 from North America, you got 10 from the U.S., Europe, very heavily, apportioned there, and Italy at 17. But this is your distribution of where the cardinal electors are coming from. Again, U.S. folks in the U.S., Catholics saying they'd like to see a U.S. pope.
Not only does he discuss the Electoral College with us, he discusses the makeup of the College of Cardinals. Anthony Salvanto will be watching all this as it starts tomorrow. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We turn to Germany now, where it took 2 rounds of voting for conservative leader Friedrich Merz to prevail as chancellor. Merz becomes the first German chancellor or head of their government in post-World War II history to fail on the first round. Germany's far-right party has fought against the new chancellor and is looking to capitalize on today's vote. They're already calling for new elections. Last night, the president dined at one of the most expensive events ever attended by a sitting commander-in-chief. Why this dinner and its ties to the cryptocurrency industry are stoking ethics concerns. You're watching America Decides.
I'm very much in favor of crypto, Bitcoin, all of the different things, because otherwise China's going to take it over. And just like AI, just like so many other industries, or whatever you want to call them, crypto is very important, I think, for our country.
As you just heard, President Trump hasn't shied away from his praise for the cryptocurrency industry, but the actions he's taking to bolster it and profit from it are raising widespread concerns. Let's bring in Sarah Ewald Weiss, no stranger to this program or to this network. She's now a political reporter for the Daily Beast. She is a former CBS News political unit producer. Great to see you again, Sarah. And you wrote this incredible report about these ethics concerns that some have. One person you spoke with the watchdog group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, called what the president is doing with crypto, quote, an intertwining of personal, business, political, fundraising, and government policy like we've never seen before. Ethical questions have been raised about Trump for years now. Why should we care about this? Why is this potentially bigger and worse than all those other ethical concerns people may have?
So this is just the latest in a series of questions about the president, who is a former business billionaire and has a long history of making business deals before he got into politics. But there has been a lot of overlap since he was first elected president. Now we're in this world of cryptocurrency and digital assets. And these ethics experts have essentially told me that the president has slapped a large sign on the White House that says open to business. And really, there are concerns about pay for play when it comes to the crypto industry. The president held a fundraiser for his super PAC at his golf club earlier this week, where the tickets went for $1.5 million a plate. And that raised money for his super PAC, but he also has been posting on social media about his meme coin, which he launched just before entering the White House for a second time. And that is also potentially raising millions of dollars for the president, as he also has a large say over how Congress and how Washington will move forward with regulating this largely unregulated industry.
And speaking of that, there is hope in the Senate of passing some legislation regarding cryptocurrency. Over the weekend, though, a handful of Democratic senators said they can't support that legislation over concerns it could directly benefit the president and his family. And they're trying to put some safeguards in this legislation, as I understand it. Can you further explain?
Sure. So this is called the Genius Act, and it actually had been moving forward with bipartisan support. Regulating the crypto industry is something that was expected to get bipartisan support in the age of Trump. But there are some challenges, and a lot of these challenges have to do with how it doesn't have actual provisions that prevent the president from personally benefiting from the industry. And so it had moved forward with bipartisan support. It had moved out of the Senate committee with bipartisan support, but there really was a really fast turnaround over the weekend with Democratic senators raising alarms. Of course, to pass legislation in the Senate, they need 60 votes, and Republicans don't have that without Democrats. So they were calling for provisions to block the president from financially benefiting. They've also raised concerns about foreign industries actually getting involved and being a part of this that could also benefit the president moving forward. So it is expected that the Senate Majority Leader John Thune was open to some changes to this legislation to help move it forward. It'll be interesting to see whether it still has a vote as it was expected to have this week, or if that'll have to be pushed back. But there are definitely some challenges for Republicans to move forward with this at this time. And some Democrats have said point blank they cannot get behind it because of what the president is openly doing when it comes to meeting with crypto industry leaders and also promoting his own meme coin on the internet.
Yeah, this is one of those things certainly the Democrats are going to keep an eye on and going to continue to raise concerns about, and can understand why, because as you said, there's legitimate concern that people are buying this to buy influence with him and with little control over it. Sarah Weiss of the Daily Beast, great to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we go, there was a surprise guest at the Met Gala in New York last night. Former Vice President Kamala Harris attended the event with her husband, former second gentleman Doug Emhoff. She embraced the theme of the gala, Superfine, tailoring black style with a black and white gown. In an interview with Vogue magazine, she said art has a significant effect on politics. The former presidential candidate has been weighing whether to run for California governor next year or mount another White House bid in 2028. She returned to the political spotlight with a speech in San Francisco, as you see here, last week. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides, Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 in the West. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned because the Daily Report is coming up next on CBS News 24/7.